There is a bridge in Normandy that most Americans have never heard of. It is not the bridge at Remagen, nor is it the bridge at Arnhem. It carries no famous name in most popular retellings of the war. There is no Hollywood centerpiece built entirely around it, and no monument is visible from the passing highway. It spans a modest stretch of the canal just outside a quiet French market town called Bonneville. And on the morning of June 6, 1944, it was arguably the single most important piece of real estate in Western Europe. This was not because of what it connected, but because of what its capture prevented. Every German armored division within realistic striking distance of the Normandy beaches had, in practice, only one genuinely viable route to the coast. Every panzer commander who received word of the Allied landings that morning reached independently the identical tactical conclusion: reach the beaches before the enemy can consolidate. Hit them while they are still soaking wet and disorganized. Drive them back into the sea before nightfall. It was on paper the only sound German strategy available, and in the narrow tactical sense, a genuinely reasonable one. Allied forces on the morning of June 6th were at their most vulnerable during the first 6 hours ashore. They were waterlogged, disorganized, tangled in their own equipment, and in more than one sector, landed some distance from where the plan had actually intended. A concentrated, well-timed armored counterattack in those first hours could plausibly have changed the entire course of the war. That counterattack never came. It was stopped by 181 men carrying rifles, mortars, and a set of orders they had rehearsed for the better part of 18 months, holding a bridge the German army did not even realize had already fallen until it was far too late to matter. This is the account of Pegasus Bridge. It is the account of D Company, 2nd Battalion, the Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and it is, in a very real sense, the account of what German officers reporting up their own chain of command that morning kept independently reaching for the same word to describe: the impossible. To understand what happened in the dark hours before dawn on June 6th, you first have to understand what the German High Command genuinely believed to be true. Berlin had spent months debating exactly how the coming Allied invasion would arrive. German intelligence had real assets working the problem. German planners had the underlying logic of coastal geography working in their favor. They knew with real confidence that an invasion was coming. The only open questions were precisely where and precisely when. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding Army Group B and personally responsible for the entire coastal defense of France, had reached his own assessment with characteristic bluntness, writing in his operational notes that spring that the first 24 hours of the invasion would prove decisive for the Allies and for Germany alike, that it would be, in his own phrase, the longest day. Rommel was entirely correct about that specific point. He was simply wrong about which side the longest day would ultimately belong to. His defensive planning rested on one foundational assumption: the Allies would arrive by sea, land on open beaches, and require several hours to organize themselves and push meaningfully inland before establishing any real defensive perimeter. In those specific hours, German armor would arrive from its staging areas and crush the beachhead before it could properly form. To make that plan actually work in practice, Rommel had argued forcefully for positioning panzer divisions close to the coast itself rather than held well back in a central reserve, the way Hitler and several senior panzer commanders preferred. The debate between the two camps had genuinely divided the German High Command for months. Rommel's own combat experience against Allied air power in North Africa had convinced him that any reserve held too far inland would simply be destroyed by fighter bombers before it ever reached the coast at all. Commanders on the opposing side of the argument, trained in the more traditional doctrine of concentrated armored counterattack, insisted a reserve dispersed too close to the beaches risked being pinned down piecemeal by naval gunfire before it could ever mass for a genuinely decisive blow. The resulting compromise satisfied nobody fully. Armor was moved within genuine striking distance of the coast, but its actual employment still required direct authorization from Hitler personally before it could move at all. It was a command structure almost perfectly engineered to produce hesitation at precisely the worst conceivable moment. Even inside that flawed overall framework, though, a genuinely workable German tactical response still existed. The specific route running from the nearest available armored formations toward the beaches around Caen passed through one unavoidable bottleneck: a pair of crossings at Benneville, the Caen Canal Bridge and the Orne River Bridge, sitting side by side, barely a few hundred meters apart. Any armor attempting to reach the eastern flank of the landing zone had to cross both of them in sequence. No alternative route existed that would not add several costly hours to the overall movement time. German military engineers had planned for exactly this contingency well in advance. Both bridges were wired for demolition, with explosive charges already set and ready. If the Allies ever seriously threatened those specific crossings, the order would go out. The bridges would drop into the canal and river below, and the armored route toward the beaches would remain firmly under German control by whatever slower alternative approach remained. It was, by any conventional military logic, an entirely sound contingency plan. It simply assumed the threat would arrive from the direction of the sea. It did not arrive from the sea. The man most directly responsible for what actually happened that night was a 30-year-old British Army officer named Major John Howard. He was not, by original instinct or civilian background, a career soldier at all. Before the war, he had worked as a police officer in Oxford. He was methodical, precise, and fiercely competitive by temperament, qualities that served him well through the relentless, almost obsessive training regime he had personally imposed on D Company in preparation for a mission with essentially no direct precedent anywhere in the recorded history of warfare. His men trained for 18 straight months against a full-scale mock-up of the two bridges built to exact dimensions in England, using aerial photographs smuggled out through French resistance channels. They ran the assault in daylight. They ran it at night. They ran it exhausted, having been deliberately kept awake for extended stretches beforehand, because Howard understood that the actual operation would be conducted by men who had not slept properly in days. By the time the real mission finally arrived, several of his soldiers could reportedly navigate the practice course blindfolded, purely from muscle memory. The operational plan itself was straightforward to describe and extraordinarily difficult to execute. In the dead of night, hours before the first American or British soldier waded ashore on any Normandy beach, 6 Horsa gliders carrying a total of 181 men would be towed across the English Channel at altitude, released over Normandy at roughly 6,000 feet, and then guided down in complete silence to a landing zone positioned close enough to the 2 target bridges that the men aboard could reach them running in under 2 minutes. 2 minutes. The margin for error was calibrated to exactly that narrow tolerance, because if German sentries received even 2 full minutes of advanced warning, they would blow the bridges immediately, and the entire armored route toward the beaches would remain permanently open to German counterattack. The gliders would approach entirely without engine power, without any engine noise whatsoever, in total darkness. The pilots had trained obsessively against a detailed sand table model of the target constructed directly from aerial reconnaissance photographs, calculating precise approach vectors, landing distances, the height of nearby trees, and the exact position of telegraph lines along the final approach path. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, piloting the lead glider carrying Howard and the first assault group, had reportedly memorized every visible feature of the landing zone so completely that he later said he could have sketched it accurately from memory in his sleep. One further problem remained genuinely unsolved, though. Horsa gliders were large, heavy, and notoriously difficult to control precisely during final approach. A miscalculation of even 100 meters could mean landing directly in the canal itself or in the flooded marshland beyond the target field. The margin between complete success and outright catastrophe was measured quite literally in seconds and single meters. The specific target itself had not been chosen carelessly. Allied planners had identified the Benouville crossings as the critical eastern choke point months earlier through a painstaking process of aerial photographic analysis combined with ground-level reporting, quietly smuggled out through French resistance networks. A local resistance member working near the canal, whose name survives in only partial form in surviving operational records, reportedly provided detailed sketches of the bridge's exact construction, including the specific location of the demolition wiring the Germans had installed. Information that let British planners understand precisely where the demolition control point sat before a single glider ever left English soil. This is worth pausing on directly because it reframes what might otherwise read as a purely military triumph. The entire operation rested on a foundation built partly by unnamed French civilians who had no guarantee of surviving the war themselves, and whose specific contribution rarely appears in the popular retelling at all. Combined with repeated reconnaissance overflights and a captured German engineering assessment of the bridge's own load-bearing capacity, this intelligence let Howard's planning staff build their training mock-up to a level of precision that included the exact width of the roadway, the specific placement of the sentry boxes, and the approximate response time an alerted garrison could realistically achieve. At 3 minutes past midnight on June 6, 1944, Walwork's glider struck the ground. The impact was violent enough that both pilots were thrown forward through the shattered cockpit nose on landing. Walwork himself suffered multiple injuries and was briefly unconscious before he could even confirm whether the approach had actually succeeded. Major Howard, thrown forward inside the fuselage behind him, regained consciousness to find the glider fully stopped. He was upright. He was alive. Through the splintered remains of the nose section, he could make out, dimly lit by starlight, the unmistakable structure of the canal bridge directly ahead. The wingtip of his glider had come to rest roughly 47 meters from the bridge itself. The element of surprise at that specific instant was total. The German sentries guarding the canal bridge that night were not elite troops by any measure. The garrison assigned to the Benneville crossings was a mixed unit, drawn primarily from the 736th Infantry Regiment, reinforced with several OSS battalions. Soldiers recruited from Soviet-occupied territory who had chosen German military service over the considerably worse prospects of an ordinary prisoner of war camp. Their overall reliability was limited under the best of circumstances. Their alertness that specific night proved worse still. Schütze Helmut Romer, a 16-year-old Berliner posted as one of 2 sentries pacing the bridge that night, was among the first to register that something unusual had happened. He initially assumed the distant sound and impact he had heard was simply a shot-down Allied bomber crashing somewhere nearby. This was a reasonable enough guess given that German air defense units had genuinely been active that same night, and given that Allied aircraft had, in fact, deliberately bombed a cement works a few kilometers to the south that same evening, specifically to condition German observers to expect exactly this kind of nighttime aerial activity without alarm. He had no established category in his own training for the actual sound of a fully loaded glider striking open ground at speed. Nobody serving on that specific bridge that night did. Nothing remotely like it had ever happened to any of them before, and nothing in the standard German sentry training addressed a threat that arrived silently from the air, with no preceding engine noise at all. Romer paused for several seconds, uncertain whether the moment genuinely called for raising a full alarm or simply waiting for the situation to clarify itself. In that specific window of German hesitation, D Company was already out of the fuselage and moving at a dead run. The assault itself was over in well under 10 minutes. Howard had divided his force with real precision beforehand. The 1st platoon under Lieutenant Den Brotheridge went straight for the canal bridge at a full sprint. Brotheridge was already across the bridge deck and past the sandbag position on the far bank before the first German shot was fired in response. He threw a grenade directly into the concrete bunker positioned on the eastern bank. He was shot through the neck moments later and fell dying on the bridge itself, becoming in the process the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day in the opening minutes of what would come to be called the longest day. His platoon sergeant later recalled that Brotheridge had only days earlier learned his wife was pregnant with their first child. He never learned the outcome and never saw either his daughter or the medal his own actions that night eventually earned him posthumously. But the bridge itself was taken. The demolition control point was located on the eastern side. The German soldier responsible for actually triggering the prepared charges had already fled his post. The connecting wires were quickly cut. The explosives themselves remained fully in place, but entirely inert. The canal bridge was securely in British hands. The river bridge, some 150 meters further east, fell almost simultaneously and with even less resistance. The small garrison stationed there offered barely any organized defense at all. 3 German soldiers were overwhelmed at their posts almost instantly. The 4th man, the specific soldier responsible for detonating that bridge's own charges, was found the following morning hiding in a drainage ditch roughly 200 meters away. He had fled without firing a single shot, without triggering his demolition charges, and without raising any general alarm whatsoever. There is something worth noting honestly about that specific man's decision, uncomfortable as it might be to sit with directly. He was, by any measure, the single individual whose personal choice that night carried the most direct tactical weight of anyone on the German side of the bridge. One man, one switch, and the entire eastern flank of the invasion would have opened up in Germany's favor within seconds. He chose to run instead, and history has largely forgotten his name entirely, while it remembers brotherages in considerable detail. By 5 minutes past midnight, both bridges stood fully secured. The entire German defensive calculation covering the eastern flank of the Normandy landing zone had been comprehensively dismantled in roughly 2 minutes of running and perhaps 8 minutes of actual fighting. What happened next, moving up through the German chain of command, stands as one of the more genuinely consequential sequences of miscommunication and institutional paralysis in the history of modern warfare. Word of the fighting at Benneville reached German officers only in fragments, and those fragments traveled slowly. A local reserve battalion commander who drove personally toward the bridges to investigate an unclear report of paratroopers landing nearby was killed en route when his staff car ran directly into British small arms fire. His own account never reached higher headquarters in any coherent form. Consider the specific mechanics of how that single loss report actually mattered. The officer who might have delivered a clear first-hand situation assessment to divisional headquarters was instead dead within roughly 40 minutes of first receiving word that something had happened near the canal. This meant the single most valuable piece of information available that night, an accurate account from someone who had actually seen the ground, simply never existed in any usable form. The full report that should have gone immediately up the chain to 7th Army headquarters did not arrive there in genuinely clear terms until considerably later. And when it finally did arrive, it arrived simultaneously alongside dozens of other fragmentary, alarming reports pouring in from every sector of the Normandy coastline at once, none of them individually painting anything close to a complete operational picture. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding 7th Army, was not at his own headquarters that night at all. He was attending a war game exercise at Rennes, well inland, an exercise whose entire premise had been to rehearse the German response to exactly this kind of Allied invasion scenario. His own chief of staff spent critical early hours simply trying to physically reach him by telephone. Rommel himself was in Germany, having left the previous day for his wife's birthday, genuinely convinced by the current weather reports that sea conditions made any near-term Allied landing operationally implausible. The German High Command that specific morning was, in the most literal sense, headless, structurally paralyzed, and desperately lacking the one specific capability that had already been quietly taken from it before the day had technically even begun: the ability to move armor quickly and confidently toward the beaches. Because even as this fragmented, contradictory picture struggled to assemble itself at German headquarters, Howard's men were already digging in around both captured bridges. They held 6 Piat anti-tank launchers, short-ranged, distinctly unreliable British infantry weapons, alongside light machine guns and standard rifles. They had in total fewer than 200 men holding a position the German army would eventually need to destroy at almost any cost. And critically, they had a working radio. At roughly 2:00 in the morning, the signal went out to 6th Airborne Division headquarters, a code phrase Howard had personally chosen, borrowed from the name of his own favorite pub back home in England. Ham and jam, ham and jam. Both bridges taken intact, mission complete. The German counterattack, when it finally came, arrived too late, too fragmented, and from entirely the wrong tactical direction to matter. The first organized German attempt to retake the bridges arrived in the early morning hours, as a company of infantry drawn from the 736th Regiment, advancing down the road from Benneville, in ordinary trucks with headlights still burning, apparently entirely unaware the bridges had already fallen fully into British hands, or that D Company had by that point established coordinated defensive positions covering both riverbanks. The lead truck rounded a bend directly into a wall of concentrated British fire. The column stopped dead. German infantry dismounted and attempted to attack across open ground on foot. They were repelled. They regrouped and tried again from a slightly different angle. They were repelled a second time. A third, smaller probe came from the direction of Ranville, where 6th Airborne paratroopers had already begun dropping in strength. That attempt, too, collapsed almost immediately, caught in a crossfire between D Company's own positions and the newly arrived paratroopers converging on the same ground from the opposite direction. By dawn, a second, somewhat larger German force arrived, this one including limited armored support, a pair of half-tracks and what appeared from a distance to be a light tank or armored car. Howard's men happened to hold exactly the weapon the moment required. Corporal Bill Gray, manning a Piat he had genuinely never fired under live combat conditions before that morning, positioned himself in a roadside ditch, waited patiently until the approaching armored vehicle had closed to a range where a clean miss became nearly impossible, and fired. The vehicle was struck directly and began burning. The accompanying German infantry, confronted with the sudden, unexpected loss of their only armored support, fell back in some disorder. Later post-war analysis would identify the destroyed vehicle as likely belonging to a reconnaissance element rather than a genuine armored spearhead, but the tactical effect at the time was identical either way. Visible proof spreading quickly among the attacking troops that the bridges were defended by something considerably more dangerous than a disorganized handful of survivors. German intelligence had initially assumed a German battalion commander's report, filed later, that same day described the situation at Benouville in terms that now carry an almost unmistakable note of genuine bafflement. The position, he wrote, was held by a force of unknown but apparently substantial size, equipped with real anti-tank capability, and German infantry could not realistically advance further without armored support of their own. Support that could not, in turn, reach the beaches without first crossing bridges that same infantry could not retake. The bridges German armor needed in order to reach the beaches were, in practice, being actively held by British infantry specifically to prevent that same German armor from crossing them at all. The underlying circularity of the German tactical position had become, for all practical purposes, completely closed. While Howard and his men held their ground through the morning, the larger German armored response was unraveling across the entire Normandy theater in parallel. The panzer divisions Rommel had specifically argued for, and Hitler had only partially conceded, sat scattered across a defensive line originally designed to counter a threat that had, in practice, never fully materialized in the expected form. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant armored formation immediately available near Caen, received a confusing, frequently contradictory stream of orders through the entire morning as reports of airborne landings, naval bombardment, and beach assaults arrived from every sector of the front simultaneously. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer, did not receive clear authorization to actually move his tanks toward the beaches until late morning, hours after the landings themselves had already begun. His division, which might in theory have reached either Sword Beach or the Benouville crossings in a comparatively short span of time, spent those critical hours instead maneuvering, regrouping, and waiting for orders that never arrived with any real clarity. Feuchtinger himself was notably not even present at his own divisional headquarters when the first invasion reports began arriving. He was reportedly in Paris that night and had to be located and recalled before he could resume active command of his own formation at the exact moment speed mattered most. When Feuchtinger finally did push an armored column north toward the coast that afternoon, the column ran directly into a massive follow-up drop of Allied paratroopers and gliders, landing squarely in its intended path. The column halted outright. Feuchtinger, observing from a forward command post, later reported watching what appeared to be an entire additional airborne division landing directly in front of his own advance, making any further forward movement effectively impossible. He was watching, in fact, the second major wave of the 6th Airborne landing precisely where Allied planners had specifically intended to block exactly this kind of German movement. It is worth noting directly that this was not simple bad luck on the German side. Allied planners had deliberately timed that second lift specifically to reinforce the eastern flank at the exact hour German armor was most likely to finally begin moving, a calculated bet on German response timing that happened to land almost precisely on target. I think this specific detail deserves to be stated plainly because it's easy to read past in a summary. The bridges at Benouville functioned as the actual hinge holding this entire defensive arrangement together. Without them secured, the paratroopers already dropped east of the Orne would have been left cut off from the beach entirely, encircled and eventually destroyed piecemeal. Without the bridges, the 6th Airborne's broader operational logic for the entire eastern flank simply collapsed. And without the 6th Airborne successfully holding that eastern flank in place, the specific armor gap Feuchtinger's division would otherwise have driven straight through on its way to the beaches became a fully viable German attack route. John Howard's roughly 200 men had not merely captured 2 bridges overnight, they had held the actual keystone of the entire Allied strategic plan for Normandy's eastern sector firmly in place through the war's single most consequential morning. Consider the specific chain reaction that a single failed detonation switch, left unpulled by one frightened German soldier, actually prevented from happening. Had either bridge been destroyed in the opening moments, had that 4th sentry simply done his assigned job, the entire eastern flank of the invasion would have opened to exactly the kind of concentrated armored counterattack Rommel had spent months preparing for. The 6th Airborne troops already committed to positions east of the river would have found themselves fighting with their backs to open water and no realistic route of reinforcement. Whether that specific failure alone would have unraveled the entire Normandy landing is honestly impossible to state with certainty. Historians who have studied the question closely tend to disagree on exactly how catastrophic the knock-on effects would ultimately have proven. The physical explosive charges themselves notably were never actually removed by Howard's men that night at all. Engineers arriving later that morning found the demolition equipment still wired in place under the bridge deck and had to disarm it properly under fire. This meant the 2 bridges had spent the entire pre-dawn battle sitting, in principle, still fully capable of being blown by anyone willing to reconnect a severed wire. It was well into late morning when the first physical contact with the main Allied force finally arrived at the bridges themselves. Lord Lovett's 1st Special Service Brigade had come ashore at Sword Beach at roughly 8 hours that morning and fought its way steadily inland through the coastal defenses, through the town of Colleville, Montgomery, across the fields and hedges of the Norman countryside, before finally reaching the western bank of the canal, where Howard's men had by then been holding the bridge against repeated German pressure for the better part of 10 consecutive hours. Lovett had personally promised Howard back during the planning phase that his commandos would reach the bridge at midday exactly. He arrived 2 minutes and 30 seconds late. His personal piper, Bill Millen, played at the head of the advancing column as it crossed the canal bridge, the distinctive sound of Scottish bagpipes rising audibly over intermittent German artillery fire still falling around the position, a detail that struck several of Howard's exhausted men, according to post-war accounts, as close to surreal, arriving as it did after 10 hours of continuous tension, punctuated by the specific sound of pipes drifting steadily closer down the same road German trucks had used earlier that morning. Howard, visibly exhausted, his uniform still soaked from the night's channel crossing, shook Lovett's hand directly on the bridge his own company had held since 5 minutes past midnight. The link-up was complete. The bridgehead was at that point genuinely secure. The eastern flank held. A German intelligence officer observing the scene from a distance outside the British perimeter later filed a report estimating the size of the force holding the bridges at somewhere between 800 and 1,000 men supported by armor. Howard had, in fact, exactly 181 men, no armor whatsoever, and 6 Piat launchers of limited reliability. That specific German officer was not remotely incompetent. He was looking directly at a small force that had successfully repelled every serious German attempt to dislodge it for 10 uninterrupted hours, and reasonably, if incorrectly, concluding that a position holding that firmly against sustained pressure simply had to be larger than what he could actually see in front of him. His mistaken estimate was, in its own quiet way, a genuine tribute to what D Company had actually accomplished. It was also, in a real sense, the moment a German staff officer first committed to an official document, something several of his colleagues had already been privately concluding since roughly 1 in the morning. Something had gone profoundly, structurally wrong along the entire eastern flank, and it could not now be meaningfully fixed. In the days immediately following the Normandy landings, German after-action reports tried methodically to reconstruct exactly where the operation had actually failed. Investigators looked for a single decisive moment, a specific command error, One tactical mistake that had allowed the Allied beachhead to consolidate as thoroughly as it did. They found in the end a genuine list of contributing factors already familiar from the morning's own events. The flawed weather assessment, the absent commanders, the delayed panzer release, the cascading communications failures that left several divisional commanders without clear orders during the war's single most critical morning. But at the specific tactical level, beneath all of those larger institutional failures, the reports also identified one narrower catastrophe that had preceded and, in a real sense, enabled all the others. A 7th Army staff officer wrote in a post-war debrief that the loss of the Orne crossings before H-hour had removed every realistic option for an early armored counterattack against the eastern beach sector. That German forces simply could not cross, could not seal the perimeter in time, and that everything which followed across the remainder of that day was, in the most direct sense, the accumulated consequence of that single fact. Everything that followed. D-Day did not fail for Germany because of raw numerical inferiority on the beaches themselves. It did not fail purely because of Allied air power or naval gunfire, or the elaborate deception operations that kept an entire German army pinned uselessly at the Pas de Calais, waiting for a landing that would never actually come there. A deception effort, Operation Fortitude, so successful that senior German commanders continued reinforcing the Pas de Calais sector for weeks after the real invasion had already succeeded, genuinely convinced Normandy itself was merely a diversion ahead of a larger, still coming assault further north. It failed at its structural core because one very specific thing happened at one very specific place, at one very specific time before the first American soldier had even reached the high water mark at Omaha Beach, before the first British landing craft had lowered its ramp at Gold, Juno, or Sword. 6 gliders landed in a dark field outside a quiet French town. 181 men ran flat out toward 2 bridges. They were across and fighting before the German sentries. Pacing that bridge had even fully processed that the sound they had just heard was not in fact wind and was not a shot-down bomber. What followed across the rest of that day would come to be called the longest day in the history of the war. But in a very real sense, its ultimate outcome had already been substantially determined in the first 10 minutes. D Company suffered real, heavy casualties in the hours immediately following its initial success. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, the first Allied soldier killed by enemy fire on D-Day, died on the same canal bridge he had crossed at a dead run with a live grenade in hand. Others fell during the German counterattacks that followed through the morning. Major Howard was wounded later in the broader Normandy campaign, injured in a vehicle accident during the eventual breakout from the beachhead. Corporal Bill Gray, who had destroyed a German armored vehicle with a weapon he had never before fired in actual combat, survived the war entirely. Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, who had piloted the lead glider with multiple injuries after being thrown through the shattered nose of his own aircraft on impact, recovered fully from his wounds and lived until 2013, one of the last surviving glider pilots of the entire operation. Private Helmut Romer, the young sentry who first heard the impossible sound and hesitated, was captured within minutes and survived the war as a prisoner. He would decades later return to the bridge repeatedly as an old man, reportedly maintaining a genuine friendship with several of the British veterans who had once stormed past him in the dark. A reconciliation that struck more than one journalist covering later anniversary events as a specific, quiet coda to the entire story. The canal bridge at Bénouville was formally renamed Pegasus Bridge in direct honor of the 6th Airborne Division's own emblem, the winged horse of Greek mythology. In the decades following the war, it became something of a modest landmark, visited primarily by British veterans and their families, rather than the large crowds drawn to Omaha or Utah. A small museum eventually opened nearby, built and expanded over the years largely through the efforts of local French residents, and surviving veterans determined that the specific details of that night not simply fade into the larger, more famous narrative of the beaches themselves. The original span was in time replaced by a modern bridge, widened to handle contemporary canal traffic. The historic original structure was carefully preserved and installed permanently beside the museum grounds, where visitors today can still walk its actual deck, and stand roughly where Brotheridge fell. But here is the specific detail popular D-Day mythology tends to quietly obscure. Buried, as it usually is, beneath the far larger, more visually dramatic story of Omaha Beach and Pointe du Hoc, and the familiar images of American infantry wading through open surf under fire. They were taken by a former Oxford police officer and 180 men who had spent 18 months training with real, obsessive precision to complete one specific task perfectly, in total darkness, in under 10 minutes. They did it in under 10 minutes. The German army never reached the D-Day beaches in meaningful armored force that day, not because of the raw firepower waiting on the beaches themselves, though that firepower was entirely real and genuinely devastating. Not simply because of Allied air superiority, though the fighter bombers hunting German columns along the Norman roads that day were a constant, well-founded terror to every driver on those roads. German armor never reached the beaches in force because the specific road it needed had already been closed. Closed since 5 minutes past midnight, technically before the invasion had even formally begun, by men who had arrived without engines, landing silently in a dark field. General Hans Speidel, Rommel's own chief of staff, wrote after the war with the particular precision of a man who had spent considerable time afterwards studying exactly what had gone wrong that morning. He identified the loss of the Orne crossing specifically as the tactical defeat from which every subsequent operational failure of that day directly derived. That the eastern flank had remained genuinely open to German forces right up until the precise moment it was not, and that by the time it closed, it had already closed before German command fully understood it required defending at all. Before we knew it needed to be defended. That specific phrase is, I think, the part of this account that most deserves to be stated clearly rather than left buried in a footnote or quietly overshadowed by the far larger drama unfolding simultaneously on the open beaches. German planners had prepared for this invasion for months in genuine, methodical depth. They had built the Atlantic Wall. They had positioned their armor as carefully as the compromised command structure allowed. They had wired the bridges for demolition well in advance. They had developed a considered response for essentially every contingency their own planning process could imagine in advance. They had simply never imagined this specific one. They had never imagined that soldiers could be flown in complete silence to a target in total darkness, land within 47 meters of a defended bridge, and take it before a single sentry had even finished deciding whether the moment genuinely called for raising an alarm. They had never imagined it, in the end, because nothing quite like it had ever actually been attempted before. It's worth pausing directly on what this specific failure of imagination actually cost. Measured against everything else German planning had gotten right, the Atlantic Wall itself, taken as a whole, represented a genuinely enormous defensive achievement. Thousands of individual strong points, millions of cubic meters of poured concrete, an obstacle belt along the beaches themselves that killed and wounded American soldiers by the hundreds within the first hour at Omaha alone. None of that engineering failed on June 6th in any meaningful sense. It simply never got the chance to matter as much as it should have, because the specific armored reserve that alone could have converted a costly beach defense into an outright Allied catastrophe never received the order to move until the single window in which that order might have changed anything had already closed. Here's a question genuinely worth sitting with, and I'd be curious what you'd say in the comments. If you had been Private Romer that night, 16 years old, alone on a bridge in the dark, hearing a sound you had never heard before and couldn't immediately place, how many seconds do you think you'd have actually needed before you were certain enough to sound the alarm? Because the entire outcome of that specific morning arguably turned on exactly that narrow human margin held inside the head of a teenager who had never been trained for the one specific threat that actually arrived. It happened once on June 6, 1944, at 5 minutes past midnight, carried out by 181 men who had no way of knowing, as they sprinted flat out toward that bridge in the dark, that they were about to help determine the outcome of the most consequential single day of the entire 20th century. They simply ran. The bridge held, and Germany had, in a very real operational sense, already lost the coming day before that day had officially begun. If this account of the silent wings that changed history has reshaped your perspective on the events of D-Day, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the pivotal moments of history that were nearly lost to time. Help us preserve these stories. Our next historical investigation will be opening soon.